These are the faculty members who have joined us today. Nikki Dell and Tat Parikh are from information science at our New York City campus, Cornell Tech. I'm Phoebe Sengers, and together with Steve Jackson, I'm in the Ithaca campus of information science, and Hakeem Weatherspoon is our colleague in computer science here in Ithaca. In computing, when we think about technology innovation, there's probably one place that's the first place that comes to mind, and that is Silicon Valley. And Silicon Valley is an amazing place where futures are being imagined every day. Technology companies like Google, Facebook, and Uber are transforming our economy, our society, and our everyday lives. Now, Cornell sends a lot of our students to Silicon Valley. Our faculty and researchers work with some of these firms. It's a really important place where ideas that are born at Cornell go out to make a real impact in the world. But while this place is amazing and is transformative, there are also things that are left out. There are some warning sounds being noted about the limits of a technological imagination that can come from a place that's dominated by a fairly narrow demographic. People like our students, young, well-educated, highly remunerated, living in an urban place, and the ways in which they might be thinking about the world. It sometimes seems like many things that are coming out of Silicon Valley are the kinds of things that programmers, young, well-educated urban professionals, would like to have themselves. As Allison REF points out, services like finding somebody to go and tank up your car for you, rating the quality of your French kissing, or sensing your child's diaper so that you don't have to. These are the kinds of things that might seem appealing to people like their designers. Young, single people who have a lot more money than time. But this limitation in turn suggests a new opportunity, an opportunity to think in new ways about what technology and technology innovation could be. If we look at it from the point of view of the people who tend not to be on the Silicon Valley radar, people like Stanley, a fisherman living on a remote island off the coast of Canada. Stanley, admittedly, is not the first person you would think about when you're thinking about technology innovation. The only computer he's ever touched is his 13-year-old granddaughter's iPad that she uses to play computer games. And when we're designing information technology, we don't tend to think about people like Stanley. We think about knowledge workers, we think about millennials, we think about city dwellers. But precisely because Stanley's life, his values, his practices, his experiences are so different from those people's, it's a great place to start thinking about what technology could be like that's different from the kinds of imaginations that we usually draw on. It provides us with a fresh lens for thinking about what people could or should want with technology. And of course, this is going to be important if it's Stanley we're designing for. But it's actually important more broadly than that. Because if we think about our own lives and our own experiences, and now I'm speaking about us as people who use a lot of these technologies and for whom these technologies are built, we see it in a whole new way when we look at it from the lens of Stanley's concerns. And we can use that viewpoint to also think in new ways about what's at stake in the way we use technology and the ways we structure our everyday lives. So today we're going to be telling you about work that we've been doing to understand the role that technology plays in people's lives and how that understanding can open up some new possibilities for technology innovation. And in doing so, we're drawing on the breadth of everything that computing and information science does. So we use social science to try to understand the real-world human context in which technology plays a role. We use design and engineering to develop and to evaluate new technologies that might fit better to those contexts. And we use education as a way to allow new kinds of voices to be able to leverage the power of technology to make a difference in the world. Today we'll be telling you about a couple of these projects. I'll be telling you about technology design and its impact on rural communities. Hakeem will tell you about cloud computing for the 99%. TAP will be telling you about how you can engage youth in civic action using data. Nikki will tell you about digital security and privacy for underserved communities. And Steve will tell us about breakdown, maintenance, and repair. And we also have a lot of time scheduled for Q&A. We're really interested in having a conversation with you guys about these topics. So, let me just go right into it. As I mentioned, I'm Phoebe Sanger. I lead the Culturally Embedded Computing Group in Information Science. My group integrates technology design with the sociology and history of technology. What we want to understand is what social impacts does technology have, and how might you be able to design technology in different ways in order to get different kinds of impacts. And today I want to tell you about the impact of technology on remote rural communities. This is based on work that my student Ron Holmer and I have been doing in small fishing villages in Iceland and Newfoundland, Canada. Like small towns across the US, these communities are facing enormous economic challenges. And our work looks at the role that technology design has played in the problems that these towns face, and to consider how we might be able to design technology differently going forwards. And the fundamental challenge that we find in these rural communities is that technology design often comes from an urban sensibility that just doesn't match well what works well in rural communities. And that's not just true of digital technologies. This is actually a long-standing problem that rural communities have been facing, and we can see this clearly in our work in the Canadian province of Newfoundland and Labrador. So this province, since it joined Canada in 1949 as its most impoverished province, has had a provincial policy of industrial development as a way to lift up its population out of poverty. The long-term impact of this policy has been the decimation of rural communities across Newfoundland. And this is for 3 different reasons. First, development has meant the adoption of lots of new kinds of infrastructures, such as electricity, telephone, television, which I can tell you was a big hit, and roads. And these kinds of infrastructures really improved people's everyday quality of life. They say, you can't even imagine what it was like beforehand. Things are so much better now. But at the same time, they introduced new kinds of constraints that fit better to the city than they do to a small island in the middle of nowhere that's frozen in for 5 months of the year. One of the constraints that was brought by electricity and telephone was monthly bills. And monthly bills are tough to pay if you live in a community that has hardly any regular wage jobs and where your income depends seasonally or annually on the fish. Earlier, you could make anything that you needed to with your own hands, but you can't produce your own television and you can't build your own telephone line. And this really introduced new constraints on how people could be employed. A second issue in Newfoundland is that development was often thought about as based on the idea of industrialization requiring centralization. It requires to scale up in order to become efficient. Small communities were often neglected by the government, at times actually actively destroyed, their population forced to move to larger communities, because it was thought that rural communities were actually simply incompatible with a technological future. There was just no way for them to continue to exist. A third issue was that industrialization meant catching as many fish as possible, trying to feed more people by making fishing as efficient and productive as it possibly could be. And the result was the decimation of the cod population, which is the #1 source of income for small producers in Newfoundland. And this has destroyed the rural economies. The town that I work with, which was once one of the most productive fishing communities in Newfoundland, is probably going to be gone in the next 5 to 10 years. Now, that all sounds like ancient history, potentially. But those effects of technology are not limited to the technologies of the last century. They're also true of the digital technologies that are being introduced today. And we see this in our project in Iceland, which is one of the most data-intensive fisheries in the world. The Icelandic fishing fleet is packed with high-tech equipment. This is what a captain's desk looks like. He can't even look outside anymore because he's got so many screens to look at. The reason that they're collecting all this data, the primary driver for this originally was to support sustainability. They don't want what happened in Newfoundland to happen to their fishery here. And so data is used to track how much they fish, and it's used to make sure they're following regulations, that they're not catching more than they could sustainably catch. And that setup has led to several unexpected consequences. The first is the way in which data and regulations start to interrelate. Data is collected in order to manage the fishery, and then using that data and management leads to pressures to collect more data, and then getting more and different kinds of data leads to the opportunity to have more kinds of regulation. And there's been a real feedback loop between the data and governance, so that fishing crews now, they aren't just collecting and processing fish, they're also collecting and processing data. And that has led to an enormous increase in their workload. A lot of the work is now not just the blue-collar work of processing the fish, but also the white-collar work of managing all this data. And that data is used to monitor what they do. So the firms that they work for, like, you did too much of catching this kind of fish today, you need to catch more of that kind of fish tomorrow. And it's also used to regulate their work activities. So it's much more regulated and structured than it ever used to be. Bureaucracy has arrived with a vengeance on the freezer trawler. A second consequence is that with this rise of governance and technology, the barriers of entry into the fishery have risen. You have to be able to afford the technology, you have to have education or to follow the rules about how you're supposed to process all this stuff and do all these things. And you have to be able to buy quota in the first place to be able to get into the fishery. And that's something most small fishermen can't afford. As a consequence, the fishery has moved from a family-based fishery to an industrial fishery, which is dominated by urban firms. And that, as in Newfoundland, has really killed rural communities that no longer get the profits out of the fishery. Now, all this might be worth it if it makes the sustainability better. But the use of data tracking inside of the quota system encourages boats to actually catch as much as they can, because if you don't catch all of your quota, you get less quota the next year. So data-driven governance has paradoxically, it's been for sustainability, but it's actually led to a pressure to catch more fish instead of a pressure to catch fewer fish. And the problem is that they're catching as many fish as they sustainably can according to this limit that they've been set, but nobody knows whether these limits are actually sustainable or not. And at the same time, that emphasis on numbers has meant that the voice of the fishermen themselves in arguments about sustainability has been lost. It's the data that now speaks for them. So, what can we learn from these two projects? The main recommendation coming out of our work is to think about the small producers explicitly and how we can support them when we're building these technologies. The major challenge that we see in these studies is that technology design is based on an assumption of scaling up from small towns to big centers, scaling up from family-based production to larger firms. And efficiencies of scale are reached by getting everybody to work in the same way and to live in the same way. And unfortunately, when everybody lives in the same way, that's usually not the way that's the best for rural producers to work. They're not in the majority. And the problem with emphasizing scaling up and uniformity is that it misses exactly what makes rural communities remarkable places with remarkable skills. And that's the ability of these small producers to adapt the things that they do to local conditions. But technology doesn't have to support centralization and consolidation. It could be designed instead to lower the barriers to allow more people to enter into the industry and to support them in being self-sufficient. And that's particularly true when the infrastructure can be homemade or it can be home repaired, when it doesn't have to be imposed by the city, when it doesn't tie rural producers into permanent relationships to industrial or urban firms. It can be designed to be adaptable to local circumstances. And Hakeem will now talk about one way to think about how to design infrastructure to be better suited to those localities.
Thank you, Phoebe. That was a very good cautionary tale. My name is Hakeem Weatherspoon. I'm a professor of computer science. I've been here about 11 years from California. So when I first moved here, they said, you're moving in the wrong direction. My area is network computing, systems computing. So virtualization, you could think about that today as cloud computing. And I'll talk to you a little more about what that is. But first of all, we all have mobile devices. We all have laptops and computers. And we all have applications that we like to play. The key today is that a lot of those applications are backed by the cloud. So for example, if you watch Netflix, that's hosted almost 100% by Amazon. If you go to an old article on New York Times, that's hosted by Amazon as well. In fact, almost a third of all data and computation will be hosted by Amazon, Google, Microsoft just in the next couple of years. This has seen a lot of efficiency, so you can almost view the cloud as utility. So just like we pay for electricity, you can pay for computation and storage in the cloud. It has spurred a lot of technology innovation. If you look at the healthcare some years back, you actually had a lot of IT written into that as reducing the cost of IT, reducing the cost of health, financial systems, science, and also society. Further, towards the end of this, I'll also talk about agriculture or digital agriculture. So you see the cloud or computing being ubiquitous throughout our entire lives. So what actually is the cloud? I have a definition here from the National Institute of Science and Technology. I'm not going to read that to you, but just focus on a couple things. The cloud is essentially network access to a seemingly infinite amount of compute and storage. So with your little iPad or phone or whatnot, you have a window into a sea or infinite amount of computing and storage resources. And what that means today is what that's backed by are a whole bunch of data centers that are spread throughout the world, usually by Microsoft, Google, Amazon are the big players in this. They have large data centers with thousands or millions of computers out in eastern Washington or in Iceland or whatnot where electricity is cheap. And you have very quick access all over the United States, South America, Europe, and Asia. Now, the issue with this is that there is one place where you don't see access. And that's parts of Africa and other parts of Asia that are quite remote. And so as Phoebe was talking about that 1% or that view from Silicon Valley, as she said, we send a lot of our students to Silicon Valley. My own viewpoint was very similar to everybody's connected. I went for the first time to Ethiopia, and I was surprised by what I saw. Now, some of you guys may have seen this before, but essentially you have a lack of reliable power. So your machines may not even be able to turn on to access the internet. You may have lack of internet connectivity. There has been an explosion of mobile devices, but if you actually have a landline or whatnot, you may not be able to access the internet. And you also have a lack of local cloud data centers, as I showed you. So that model that I had from the previous few slides, where we have a third of all data and computations hosted by just a very few of the world's companies, is not actually true for a significant swath of the world. And I'll talk to you about a couple challenges. But one of the key challenges is, how do we enable this promise that we see here to the rest of the 99%? So when I went to Ethiopia, I went to 4 universities: Addis Ababa Science and Technology, Addis Ababa Institute of Technology, Mekele Institute of Technology, and Adama Science and Technology. So these were four science or STEM-based universities. They should be at the forefront of computing in that environment. But yet you can see on the right here that this was their data center, and actually at the time I was there, it was having some power issues, and you couldn't actually access the internet from outside of the university. This was the Mekele Institute of Technology, or MIT in Ethiopia. And so that was surprising to me, and actually since then, with a colleague, we've written a proposal for an edge cloud that can actually work in a disconnected mode. So one that can work on local computing resources, one that can work with cell phone as well. So essentially, if you're disconnected from the connected world that we're used to, you can still have a view of the internet and a lot of the data centers and whatnot. And so we're working on that in a couple different domains. One is for first responders here. So if you think about all the hurricanes that we've had, you actually lost a lot of communication. So being able to create an edge cloud in a response to emergency, being able to create a cloud where there's actually little power, and being able to have access to the computing and storage that really enable efficiencies in our lives. Another aspect of this is a sugarcane farm in Ethiopia. So we're also here within Cornell starting a digital agriculture institute or whatnot. Right now it's in its infancy. It's across CALS, Cornell Agriculture and Life Sciences, Cornell Computing and Information Science, and Engineering and Business, where we actually come together to grab the strengths of Cornell and actually create what Phoebe was talking about, which was sustainability, but use the cautionary tale that she alluded to. And so the key here is, one of the driving forces is, how do we sustainably feed 10 billion people by 2050? So in 2050, we're supposed to go from 7.5 billion today to 10 billion then. At the same time, we'll have not that much more land to actually grow on, so you'd have to be more productive. And you may actually have less water to use, so you have to be more efficient with the water. With digital agriculture, you can actually, there is a collaboration with Microsoft that showed that you can actually use images from drones or whatnot to take pictures of the land to see where you should actually water, apply the watering in a precise manner, and actually reduce the amount of water consumed by 2/3, in some cases 90%. So that's just a small case of how we could apply digital agriculture to make lives much better in the year 2050. Also, it's 30 years between now and then, but a lot of the growth will actually come in the African region. So Nigeria is supposed to be larger than the United States by that time. Ethiopia is already 100 million people, so it's already the top 10 country, and it'll be around 200 million at that time. So there's quite a bit of challenges that we can gain efficiencies if we do it in the right way of balancing the technology with the people itself. So part of that sustainability is actually the economy and the people as well, which we're considering. And so with that, I'll go ahead and pass this on to Tap.
So I'm going to be taking a little bit of a detour here. Talk about how some of these issues might manifest a little bit more closer to home in our own United States and in the communities that we live in here domestically. So I'm going to talk about this idea called representation technologies, and the idea here is that we can use technology as a way to kind of critically reflect upon some of the sources and manifestations of inequality in our society today. And that this kind of brings us back to the title of our panel, the technology for the 99%, and Phoebe's initial remarks, that we are often designing for this very elite, educated population. And so how do we create technologies that serve a broader swath? And one way is to use technology to actually reflect on the sources and how inequality manifests in our society. But not only reflect, but also use technology as a way to advocate for social changes and policies that might benefit our communities. So my research group really looks at these two kinds of issues, how technology can be used as a tool of reflection, but also as a tool for advocacy and representation as well. So I'm going to talk about one specific project in this domain, this project called Local Ground. And just to connect to Hakim's talk, this map is actually from Ethiopia. My student, Sarah Van Wart, was looking at agricultural issues. So some of my prior work was in agricultural development. And so my student Sarah was looking at kind of agricultural development in Ethiopia. And when she went to kind of the planners and the agricultural ministry, they really said, we don't know what's going on in rural areas. We don't really know how people are using land. We don't know what problems people are facing. We don't know how they'd like to develop and how they'd like to use land in the future. And then when she went to rural areas, she saw these really rich maps on the walls in schools, in community centers and agricultural cooperatives. And she thought, why is there this big disjoint? Why do local people have such a good understanding of what they're doing and what they want and how they'd like to develop, and the planners and the people who make decisions really have no sense of this? And this brings up ideas like seeing like a state from James Scott, if some of you are familiar with that. But this is like a canonical problem in development and planning, is that the people who are making decisions don't know the perspectives of the people who they're trying to serve. And so we took this idea and we brought it back. I was at Berkeley until last year. And so we brought it back to the Bay Area, and we tried to understand the same problem from the perspective of youth that are living in underserved communities in the Bay Area. And we work with a number of nonprofit groups, schools, and other organizations in the Bay Area to bring youth perspectives into the planning process. And I'll give you a couple of examples how we did that. So one was around an urban development project. There was a new park and a school and a community center being developed in Richmond, which is a community just north of Berkeley. And young people were brought into this process as part of their social studies class. And what we did was we worked with the young people to kind of collect data about how these spaces were being used now, what problems the youth saw in these communities, how these kinds of existing practices could be supported better through the planning process. And so young people went out and they collected a lot of data, but in the form of hand-drawn maps, just like we saw from the Ethiopia example. They basically were able to annotate these hand-drawn maps. And then the technology we built was able to extract those annotations using some simple computer vision and then aggregate them all in one place on any kind of base layer, like a satellite map or a Google map or an OpenStreetMap. And so this brings us kind of like one of the first basic principles of what data brings us. Data allows us to take all of these individual observations and ideas that these young people had and aggregate them. So that's one thing that this idea of data brings, is this notion of aggregation and what kind of power that can bring to the advocacy process. And so one thing you'll see when we aggregated all these maps, you'll see what looks like all these little chef's hats. You guys see these little chef's hats on the map? Why would there be all these chef's hats on this school? Anyone have any idea why there could be so many chef's hats?
Where they eat lunch.
That's a good guess. But actually, when we asked the kids, those were actually cupcakes. Those were drawings of cupcakes. And so it wasn't because kids were eating cupcakes. It's because in that community, cupcaking meant making out. And so these were the areas where young people. This is like literally, it's literally a heat map. If you guys know. So again, but this is funny, but it's again another like kind of idea of how data is powerful. Creating these kind of iconic representations of empirical phenomena bring this evocative power into it. And so in this case, cupcakes. So they also made a plan for how the park should be developed in the future. They had a running track, they had a graffiti wall, they had a pond, they had various kinds of walking paths, and then they took these maps and they presented them at the town hall meeting, which I'll show you right now.
So if you had like a snack bar in the community, people walking across the street where it's not safe.
So the guy in the suit just showed up at the right time for our video. He was like exactly the right time, excellent timing. But what this example shows is how maps and data could be used as a tool for not only representing simplified phenomena, but actually representing the complexity of places and the complexity of behaviors and activities that happen in those places, and how they could be better supported through the planning and decision-making process. I have another example here, which is about ground truthing public data. So here the young people actually downloaded an existing data set. And so this is a data set from Oakland. So all of the purple dots, according to the county, are grocery stores in Oakland. And so when the young people saw this map, they were like, no way, there's not that many grocery stores in East Oakland. And so we were working with a school, Castlemont High School in East Oakland, where the young people then designed their own survey. And so they designed their own survey that they went out to each of these grocery stores, and they collected data. They decided on their own categories for these locations, whether they were grocery stores or something else. They rated these stores, they took notes on each of these locations, and then they came up with their own map. And their own map showed that some of these places, according to them, were actually grocery stores, where others were convenience stores, others were liquor stores, others were specialty stores. And this was kind of the ground truthing of the data from their perspective. And so they were also able to combine this data not only with this kind of categorical or structured data, but also to combine it with what we would call qualitative data, which is pictures, interviews, narratives. And so here are some examples of the other kinds of data the young people collected.
How was it when you went inside?
It was dirty when I went inside, and I would never eat anything in there.
Do you consider this to be a grocery store?
Hell no. Because they don't sell any groceries, and it's just a bunch of junk food in there.
It just came out like a supermarket. It was called Gonzalez, and I liked it. I felt like everything was organized, and it was nice, and I saw like the workers fixing everything that were like out of place.
I'm all stuff, but it's not like, hell, it's like, they have their one little section as if you were in a regular store.
So that, for them, that was the differentiator between what was a convenience store or a liquor store and a grocery store. Do they sell single beers? That was and again, that's another powerful aspect of data. Where do you draw the line? Where do you draw the line between one thing and another? And so many times the power of data is where you draw the line, not in what the underlying phenomena is. This last example I'll go through very quickly. So here, young people went through the entire Bay Area with particulate matter sensors measuring air quality. They made their own visualizations of air quality. And one thing that they found was that the underground BART stations had very poor air quality. And so they eventually found out that this was because of the friction from the brakes and poor ventilation in those underground BART stations. And so they went and they made a presentation using all of these different kinds of data. And they also published the results in an op-ed in the Huffington Post. And here is the young people themselves reflecting on what the power of this process was.
You cannot make a change if you don't know there's a problem. So therefore you have to recognize it and allow others to acknowledge it, so therefore the process of coming up with a solution can be possible.
A lot of people in California have asthma, and it's really bad and it can kill you. So that's our whole point of doing this research, because we want to inform the people who have asthma and let them know that we're breathing in, and try to help them fix it by talking to the BART station. You can actually tell if they listen to what you were saying, and if the decrease, you know they change something on the BART system. But if it increase, that means you have to keep bugging them until they change it.
So again, reflecting on the power of data in terms of increasing young people's civic agency, right? And so young people are not only using this data and these tools as a way of getting involved in their communities, but they're also learning some fundamentally important principles about data and its use in civic discourse, representing complexity, the power of aggregation, the importance of categorization, how data can be used in civic context to make your voice heard and to affect change, right? These are all principles about data that we often take for granted. So I'll kind of step to this. We're working on this tool. We're trying to make it publicly available. There's a lot of work that goes into that. And we work very closely with people at Cornell Tech involved in outreach into our schools and supporting the deployment of this kind of curriculum in our schools and making sure teachers are well equipped to do this kind of work in classrooms. Thanks very much. Lots of partners, lots of students. Thank you.
Great. So while we switch over, so it's on. So my name is Nikki Dell, and I'm an assistant professor in information science at the Cornell Tech campus in New York City. I've been at Cornell now for almost 2 years, which is new by Cornell standards, but perhaps not so new by Cornell Tech standards, which is itself very new. And my work really looks at human-computer interaction. So I like to think that I focus both on technical innovation and on side of innovation and on how to combine those things to create systems that have an impact. I focus mostly on designing and building systems for underserved communities, and these are a bunch of pictures from various projects that I've done over the years. So if any of them look interesting, I'd be happy to talk to you afterwards and talk about some of the work that I do. Today I'm going to focus really on some of my newer work, which is looking at digital security and privacy in non-Western populations. So as several colleagues pointed out, but especially Hakeem, in the next few years, hundreds of millions of people across the world are going to be adopting these mobile devices that we all carry around, smartphones, and using them for all kinds of important activities, including mobile health, digital finance, education, communication. And undoubtedly, these devices bring numerous benefits to populations across Africa, across Southeast Asia. But these devices also bring inherent risks. And people's general lack of understanding about these technologies, this is probably the first time they've ever used any digital technology. They don't have the technological experience or understanding to really evaluate those risks of their data or to understand how to better protect themselves or their data. And at the same time, many of the values and usage patterns that these populations have are very, very different from Western populations that have driven the design of these mobile devices. So my students and I have done a variety of studies to try and understand some of the privacy challenges that these populations face. We've studied the Bangladeshi government's biometric registration program, which forced all Bangladeshi citizens to provide their fingerprints to the government if they wanted to keep using their mobile phone. We've also recently done a study in Bangladesh that looks at how families share devices. Many of these communities have much more collectivist cultures than Western populations. And so sharing devices is really common. In some cases out of economic need, because the family can only afford one device among all of the family members. But in other cases, just because sharing is part of the culture. And so even if each family member owns a device, all of those devices are still used and shared by everybody in the family. And this sharing is not well supported by today's devices and raises a whole host of privacy challenges. So the first observation here is that this personal computing paradigm that has driven much of the device design over the last couple of decades, from PCs to mobile phones, in which I'm an individual and I have my personal device and my personal accounts on that personal device, just fundamentally don't fit anymore with these kinds of populations. So we really need to change the design. At the same time, as my colleague Steve will speak about next, many of these societies have very rich repair and reuse cultures. And so it's very common for people to just sell their device or give it away to somebody else. Not only the physical handset itself, but also the SIM card inside it, that is the phone number, and all of the services that are registered to that phone number. So all of that stuff now belongs to somebody else, and any data associated with those accounts also now belongs to somebody else, which raises huge privacy challenges. A lot of these societies are also deeply patriarchal, and it can be culturally appropriate for men to control women's access and to monitor how women are able to use technology, which makes it difficult for women to have any expectation of privacy at all. And then finally, there are often serious consequences of privacy breaches. So in these kinds of socially conservative societies, some of the attacks that are now becoming relatively frequent in today's society, things like identity theft, things like non-consensual pornography, become extremely serious for especially women living in these kinds of societies. So what all of these suggest is that we really need fundamentally new privacy mechanisms that take into account these different values and different usage patterns that these populations have today. And this is something that my students and I will be working on in the next few years. For example, you might imagine that we could redesign password authentication mechanisms so that the same application, say Facebook, if I log in using one password, it might show the version of Facebook that I'm happy to share with all of my brothers and sisters and family members. If I enter a different password, it might show data that I'm willing to share only with my spouse. And then if I enter a third password, it might show only data that is very personal and private for me. And this would be the only difference in the application, so that if my husband comes and demands to see what I've been doing, I can enter one password and he can look at what I've been doing, but I can still have that underlying privacy with a different password if that's what I want. And you can imagine that a lot of these sorts of solutions that might be specifically designed to support non-Western populations in underserved regions could also enable innovation for many populations in the US. So innovation that's designed for global contexts could feed into innovation that works in the US, and then obviously in the other direction as well. And I think all of us here today very much believe in this and care for it. And so one way that my work is trying to do this, and I'll talk about now, is looking at similar privacy concerns, but instead of in the context of non-Western populations, looking at it in New York City in the context of intimate partner violence. So intimate partner violence is a huge societal problem. A recent survey by the CDC found that 25% of all women and a little over 10% of all men report suffering from rape, physical violence, or stalking by an intimate partner at some point in their lifetime. So this is a huge number of people. And as you might imagine, as these digital devices become more and more integral in our everyday lives, they also play a very pivotal role in intimate partner violence situations. And so the goal of this work was to understand what is the role that technology plays in intimate partner violence, and then build new systems that do a better job of providing digital safety and privacy for victims of intimate partner violence. So over the past year, we've partnered with the New York City Mayor's Office to Combat Domestic Violence to conduct a study of the intimate partner violence ecosystem there. We've now spoken to almost 100 survivors of intimate partner violence and professionals who work with them, from attorneys to police, caseworkers, social workers, and so on. And what we've uncovered is that abusers really use technology in all kinds of ways to intimidate, threaten, impersonate, and harass their victims. And I'm not going to list the ways here because they're far too long. But a couple of interesting things happen in these situations that really overturn conventional cybersecurity mechanisms, which consists mostly, again, of my personal device, my password, and that is the barrier to getting my data. So for example, in a lot of cases, the abuser and the victim are married. They have kids together. And this often results in the abuser actually owning the device or the account that the victim uses, either through wireless family plans or so on. And this means that as the legal owner of this device, they can track it, they can shut off services, they can look at the activity on that account and really keep control of every aspect of it. Even if they don't own these accounts, they often have a very close relationship with the victim, so they can probably guess their password, or they already know their password. Or if not, they know how to answer the security questions correctly so that they can break into that account and then take it over and reset the password. Once they have access, they can post all kinds of harmful messages, impersonate the victim, usually to try and destroy their personal relationships, or to expose their private information, for example, through non-consensual pornography. And unfortunately, what we found is that the pace of technology change and the complexity of these social situations means that the legal system and many of the service providers are just not doing a good job of providing ways for victims of intimate partner violence to seek help and to get content taken down or to get their account back if it's been hijacked. So my collaborators and I at Cornell Tech have begun a multi-year research agenda to try and make some positive impact in this space. So we're currently in the middle of developing doing a measurement study of the intimate partner violence spyware ecosystem, so looking at applications that abusers put on their victims' devices to track them or monitor their communications. And a really interesting thing to point out here is that it's not just evil spyware, illegal spyware that we're talking about, but in these situations, many, many legitimate applications can actually be used to spy on victims. For example, things like Find My Phone, Find My Friends, parental monitoring applications are all currently used by abusers to track their victims. We're also trying to understand how to automatically detect when an abuser logs into a victim's account and then take appropriate action, which itself is complex because simply shutting off that access could cause the abuse to actually escalate. So even if you can detect access, what to do when there is access can be a difficult decision. And then finally, we're working with people in the law school, social policy side of things, to develop new technology assessments, to inform victims about the risks, and try and provide them with better educational tools that can help them understand their own privacy and do a better job of protecting themselves. So with that, that's just a couple of examples of my work, and I will hand over to Steve.
Great, thank you, Nikki. So I'm going to give you a little sense of where I'm coming from, sort of location and discipline-wise. My work is broadly in the area of information ethics, law, and policy. I teach a class here at Cornell, which has gone from 40 to 300 in the last 3 years, most of them outside of CIS. This work has a formal legal dimension to it, so we walk through a lot of details of network and spectrum policy, antitrust and competition, intellectual property, privacy, security law, etc. But it's also got a broader set of questions that lies behind it, which are broadly in the ethical social science space. Questions like who gains and who loses from technological change, how do emerging technologies intersect with other lines of social division, and I give you the thought, one person's infrastructure is another person's barrier. We look at whose stories of technology get told, and we ask in particular about what and where is innovation, and can we tell broader, more truly global and representative stories about innovation where we find it. So this, among other places, this has led me to a long line of research around something you may not have thought a lot about in the past, which is around questions of technology breakdown, maintenance, and repair. We've been doing field work in countries around the world over the last 7 or 8 years, including Namibia, Bangladesh, Uganda, and now in Cambodia. Also here in the US and Europe, which I'll mention in a minute, supported by a wide variety of funders from the US National Science Foundation to the World Bank to Intel, etc. A part of this work is looking at what we're talking about as livelihood repair in the global south. So this particular image is from the Gulistan underground market, which is the largest repair market in Bangladesh. And there are very many similar scenes of this elsewhere in our work. We've also looked at amateur repair movements in the US and in Europe. So last week I was actually in the Netherlands talking with people from the Repair Cafe, which is one of their largest amateur repair movements. All of these images, though, are from New York. Those of you who live in the city area could join for this. It's a group called the Fixers Collective. They used to be based in Brooklyn. Now they also meet in Manhattan. And the idea is this is a group of people who gather on a monthly basis, or sometimes more often than monthly basis, people bring in broken technologies and they fix them together. It's a very interesting cross-section of people. If I were to identify the three main groups, it's Brooklyn hipsters, poor people, and retired AT&T engineers. So it's not that often you encounter those three people, the groups of people in the same spot. These particular research sites, though, are actually part of a larger interest in maintenance and repair that comes from a sensibility that I've called elsewhere broken world thinking, which is a recognition that whether we're talking about New Orleans after Katrina, whether we're talking about Puerto Rico after Maria, or whether we're talking about the long-run state of technological objects themselves, things fall apart. And that a great deal of human skill, innovation, and ingenuity is invested in the ongoing maintenance and operation of order in the world. And for those of you who have really worked with technology, you are intimately, painfully familiar with this fact, or even as a user of technology, that the story of technology is a story of failure and repair, failure and repair. Things are routinely breaking. Things don't function automatically and as a feature of good design, although design is important in this context, that there is an enormous amount of ongoing maintenance and repair work that's required to keep technological systems, objects, and infrastructures active in the world. And that basically is the underlying principle of broken world thinking. Okay, so what are some of the things we found in this work? One of the things we want to emphasize is the remarkable forms of technical skill, knowledge, and innovation to be found in repair work, and how this contrasts with global lack or gap stories, which usually characterizes how we think about questions of technology in the developing world. So these are all images from repair workshops in Dhaka in Bangladesh. And if you're interested, the procedures being performed here from top left are procedures that are locally called jumpering. Elsewhere in the world it's called looping, reballing, pin extracting, and servicing. Without going into the details of these operations, I will note only that these are things that do not happen in North America. These are operations on cell phones that literally do not happen in an American context. They do happen in Bangladesh and places like this. And in fact, many phones that are broken in North American and European contexts make their way somewhat circuitously, usually through Hong Kong and Shenzhen, and ultimately into Bangladesh, and are then repurposed and repaired through these mechanisms. We are very interested in processes of learning, collaboration, and transmission that support this work. From global online discussion groups, there's actually a group called the GSM Forum, which has sort of shown up as a recurrent actor. Every time we show up at a new site to do field work, inevitably within the first couple of weeks we encounter somebody, a local technician, referencing the GSM Forum. There's also a huge role to apprentice learning in these kinds of contexts, whether we're talking about the livelihood repair sectors that we're looking at in the Global South, or if we're looking at the Fixers Collective kinds of operations in New York. And a lot of that has to do with the nature of repair itself. There's a lot of conceptual knowledge, schematic knowledge that goes into repair, but a lot of it is also a very tactile and craft-based form of knowledge. So think of the example of trying to describe how tight to tighten a screw. Right, this is the kind of thing that resists easy codification and has historically been trained through apprenticeship. One of the things that actually initiated a lot of this work, our first study in this area was actually in Namibia, and one of the most glaring findings from this really had to do with the radical disconnect between formal government and sometimes international donor programs and local repair networks. So we were involved in something called Computers for Kavango, which is part of the Kavango region of Namibia. That's kind of the upper right line that extends on the map there. And what we found in there and in many other sites that we've looked at is that a lot of formal technology for development programs fail precisely at the point of maintenance and repair. And the tragedy in the Kavango region is that there's actually a very robust local repair network, but the terms of the development agency and the national government in this case required all repairs to be shipped back back to Windhoek, the capital, to be fixed, which almost never happened, with the result that most of the computers in the Computers for Kavango region were broken and left sitting on floors, while the local repair network lost work and was underfunded. We've also thought a lot about barriers to repair, both at the physical level and at the software level. So at the physical level, this is really a story, as repairers like to say, of glues and screws, right? What are the things that prevent people from accessing their devices? What's the thing that prevents me from getting inside my, in this case, iPhone 7? One of them is proprietary screw sets, and there's kind of an arms race that goes on. One of the things I do as part of this work is collect screwdrivers that are required to open various devices. I'm up now over 100, and it keeps coming. I would have brought them in, but it's actually a pretty big box at this point. Does anyone recognize the screw on the right? You've probably seen this. This is an Apple pentalobe screw. There's a couple generations since that screw, actually. This is a couple years old now, that slide. And glues, so adhesives that keep the device locked, and if you open the device, it's so gummed up with adhesive that you basically destroy the parts in accessing it. We've also looked a lot at proprietary controls, so the relationships between what are often talked about as authorized versus independent repair shops, which is a division that runs right down the center of places like Namibia and Dhaka that we've looked at. And that has, a lot of that has to do with the control of schematics, firmware, updates, etc. So the authorized dealers have access to the kinds of information that the main manufacturers, Apple, Samsung, Nokia, etc., choose to give to their authorized repair centers. But most of the repair work is actually happening in the independents who lack access to that except through informal workarounds that are sometimes worked out with those authorized centers. And then the last point, which is a very interesting one, which is a long story I could say a lot more about, we could talk about it in questions if people are interested, are some of the legal barriers to repair work that operate here in the US, but also in some of the other parts of the world we looked at. That includes warranty assertions, the assertion that you may have heard that if you open your phone, the warranty is void. I want you to think about an analogy. If you open the hood of your car, your GM 50-year powertrain warranty is void. It's an absurd comparison, and there's some legal question as to whether, in fact, that kind of warranty assertion is sustainable. We've also looked at questions of copyright and how that intersects with repair-relevant materials, including the copywriting of repair manuals and things like that. The misapplication of Digital Millennium Copyright Act anti-circumvention clauses, and a longer story in the legal space. The last thing I want to point out as a key finding, actually, though, is around harms and costs. So a lot of what we do in our work is look at the very good and profound and important and innovative work that we think maintenance and repair does in the world. But we also want to be mindful of the real costs of that work. So on that score, I want to direct your attention to a particular subcategory of repair worker that exists in the Bangladeshi repair worlds. And this is a group called the Bangari. The Bangari, the literal translation would be broken people. And what the Bangari do are they circulate through the repair networks, through the everything in Dhaka, and they effectively function as a recycling mechanism, picking up parts from one repair shop, bringing it to another, bringing it to recyclers, etc. And here are some of the issues that they encounter in their work. And I'm just going to quote from some field notes from my PhD student, Ishtiaq Ahmed, who is the principal field worker on this project. If you look carefully, the skin of their hands has been hardened and blackened. I have talked with 20 Bangaris in total about the health issues, including 5 senior Bangaris who are shop owners. All 16 of the lower Bangaris reported problems. These were skin problems in hands and feet, reduced eyesight and burning eyes, problems breathing, reduced hunger. 10 of them mentioned the word bish while describing the discarded electronics. The Bangla word bish has multiple meanings. One common meaning is poison. The other common meaning is pain. All of them believe that you can become sick, both by germs carried by the motherboards and by the evil things that the motherboard had touched. I asked for an example from each of them. They pointed to dark spots on the boards. One of them said, "This is burnt, and this now emits poison to you. You touch this, and you start rotting. We work here because we don't have any other option. We have touched this, so we are now having problems because of the poison." Another pointed to the back side of the motherboard where there were many pins. He said, "These pins are dangerous. When you work with the motherboards, it is natural that the pins will hurt you. Those pins will reach your blood and bring the poison there." Then he showed me his hands and said, "I have hundreds of such wounds. I am poisoned." Another Bangari told me how his son became ill, and then he stopped touching his son. Another Bangari thinks he is now addicted to the poison, just like drugs. Okay, so I've just given you a wild range of experiences in this world. I want to call attention to a number of key points, and then I'll turn to a more general wrap-up and we can open the discussion. I want to emphasize to you the nature of maintenance and repair work as key sites of technical skill, imagination, and expertise, sometimes especially in places where we don't look for there to be a lot of technical skill, imagination, and expertise. I want to make the argument for maintenance and repair as core infrastructures of sustainability, both technical and environmental. I want to make the point that repair work is and can be costly, including and perhaps especially under conditions of invisibility. The invisibility of repair work is one of the things that allows some of the harms and costs of repair work to be absorbed by vulnerable populations. I've talked a little bit about some barriers to more robust and effective repair regimes, and without saying more about it, there are vast implications for the design of technologies, complicated implications, but also policy, practice, etc. Okay, so now I'm stepping away from my talk and doing the more general wrap towards a global, inclusive, and socially engaged computing and information science, which I think are words that describe our shared commitments as a group, and I would say the shared commitments of computing and information science more generally. One of the things that the same sets of initiatives point us towards is a commitment to inclusion and diversity in our work as educators on the pedagogical side. So there are a couple of wonderful new initiatives that I will just sort of put up and we can talk about more if people would like. One of these is the Sonic Summer Research Workshop, oriented to bringing more underrepresented minorities into computer science PhD programs each year. Another one is a pre-sophomore summer program, which is dealing with the problem of attrition, the greater than the average problem of attrition as underrepresented minorities head upwards sort of in the educational pyramid. So more broadly, we've tried to sketch for you a more truly global and globally engaged picture of technology and computing in the world, including ones which don't rely on a simple export or replica model, which assumes that technology there ought to, in an ideal world, look like technology here. The challenges of truly coming to terms with the real-world circumstances of the places and lives that computing and technology research is increasingly called upon to engage. For example, Hakim's story about the challenge of designing for intermittent infrastructures, which certainly shares many common threads with the forms of breakdown encountered in my field work as well. It also includes the local forms of skill, knowledge, and infrastructure already present in the environments that we sometimes seek to touch and engage through technology. We err as technologists if we start out by assuming that it's a blank slate. The world is never a blank slate, that any of the worlds we touch already come loaded with histories, with forms of skill and expertise which we ignore at our peril. We've tried to indicate, at least in part, the challenges but also opportunities that confront efforts to design and build for traditionally underserved communities, as you've heard across a number of the talks here. And we've tried to show how some of these research-based engagements might also translate into a core rethinking of how we imagine and practice technical education and learning itself at levels ranging from K through 12 to stuff that we do here at the university in computing and information science. Summing across these experiences, we'd note that our computing problems are heterogeneous problems that call upon the full width of what CIS can offer, and in fact, what Cornell as an institution can offer. To tackle these problems, you don't need a research program, you don't need a department, you actually need a university that can actually address the multiple forms and facets of the problem encountered. And if we're seeking to understand the real-world story of technology, innovation, sustainability, and global change, I'll submit that we may need to think a little bit less about people like this and a little bit more about people and places like this. So with that, we welcome any and all thoughts and questions.
You guys can share. Okay.
Thank you. Yes, please. Yeah, that's a great question. So how do we connect these things with the companies that are building these kinds of technologies? Does anybody?
I can say something. So certainly we have been trying very hard to engage with, for example, Facebook and Google and some of the intimate partner violence work, and they're hugely open to it and excited about it. I think they really want to do a better job of accommodating these things. Of course, their focus is always on not trying to harm the general experience of all their other users, and so the engagement is somewhat constrained by what we want them to do and what they're willing to do. But I think in general, it's certainly I personally have a very productive conversation with people at those companies, and generally they want their devices to work for underserved communities as well. They just don't necessarily do the design work to make it that the case.
Yeah, I'll note that on a lot of the repair work, like the Bangladeshi repair work, was primarily funded by Intel. So I think there's a strong interest definitely in the research arms of a lot of the major tech firms. I think there's a growing recognition that the stuff that they've learned to do in the markets, in the places where they've succeeded so far, may or may not apply to some of the markets they want to go into, like sort of thinking from the standpoint of those companies. And so I think there's a recognition that at least some investment in truly understanding the difference in conditions that confront computing in different parts of the world is welcome and needed. I've had actually very little pushback from companies. Mostly what I've found is people really engaged and curious and then asking, okay, that's a really good point. What could we do differently? John?
Comment. I see a missing member of your team, which would be someone from the business school.
Mm-hmm.
What we're really talking about here, for me, certainly in the hardware end of things, is design objectives. Mm-hmm. So if you're going to design a system to be repairable in Ethiopia, mm-hmm. that creates a set of objectives, which, if you put it in front of a product design team, mm-hmm. would in fact result in a product that would deliver the results you're looking for, mm-hmm. or get a lot closer to it. So you need some business component to it so that you can make that connection between what you're seeing in your market mm-hmm. and what these big companies who see these as secondary opportunities would have to do to meet them.
Yeah. Do any of you want to?
I mean, I think, I would agree with you. I think that's definitely a very astute observation, and I think there's a lot of challenges with bringing the kinds of innovation that we've talked about to market. I've had some experience in the startup realm, which has given me some perspective on it, and my perspective is that it's really hard.
Yeah, I'll note that there's no one from the business school here on this particular panel, but the business school in general has been invested in these questions. There's a very famous, some of you may know, bottom of the pyramid understanding, which comes in part out of Cornell research. And that's grounded in the business school, and it's looking at how might firms reimagine their markets and the globalization of their markets if we took those sort of the numbers have changed since this first came out. What they used to say is the bottom 4 billion when there were only 5 billion on the planet. I guess now it's probably scaled up a little bit since then. But there is a rich connection there to be built, and I absolutely agree on the importance of bringing these things through that network as well.
I keep hearing about the underserved populations that you're looking at. Where's the senior population in this? Because I know a lot of seniors So trying to adapt to the new models and things that are coming out, or you're listening to your younger generation who want certain things from you, or you're supposed to be banking. So much of our lives as senior citizens now revolve around this banking process, this medical process, this every process, and people really don't do so as much as they are assumed to do that. And when you leave a working environment where you've been provided updated technology or the training to use all of these things, that's where your skill level stops, pretty much. So who does anything for the senior citizens?
Yeah, I think that's a really great observation also. I mean, I didn't get a chance to talk about all the things that we're doing, obviously, in my group in Cornell Tech, but, one of the things we're doing is we're working very closely with the Senior Center on Roosevelt Island, where Cornell Tech is, design IT skills and general web literacy programs there that help the seniors there do things like manage email and interact with web search. And I've also had the experience in my career where, we came up with a new voice-based messaging system that was originally designed for small farmers in India, which was then later adapted by another researcher to be used for senior populations also to stay in touch with their loved ones and to share their own content. So I think just as Nikki said, I think there's a real great opportunity when we look at some of these design challenges that they could be cross-cutting. And generally the design methodologies and the innovations we come up with could work for multiple populations.
One of the things I'll add on to that is their lack of understanding of security and privacy.
Yeah.
And I get emails from acquaintances and family who've been hacked, and they're warning people not to open certain things. And it took them a while to even recognize it after some major task was done. So I don't know if that's the responsibility at times to be looking at maybe the marketer or the seller of the product, to be also making sure that people understand where the security features, et cetera, are.
Yeah, absolutely. I fully agree. And it's a really interesting challenge to try and come up with good educational materials that give people actionable advice. At the moment, there's what we see across all of the security and privacy work I'm doing is a lot of general advice that's things along the lines of go and change your privacy settings, but not how to get there, what they are, what to change them to. It turns out that doing that in a sustainable way with the pace of technology change is definitely non-trivial, but it's certainly something that is kind of one of the key objectives of our work in security and privacy.
I just need to check, Mari, one more question. You can put your hands back up now. Yeah.
Sorry. You mentioned black spots on your hands, bad breathing, poison that goes into your blood. What are the actual physical risks, dangers, hazards of people in a third world country who take apart multiple devices?
There has been no systematic public health research on this question. That's one of the reasons that I'll let you say in a minute if you know some good.
There has been in the recycling end of this. So eventually
Right.
these things get ground up and recycled, and there are a lot of poisonous materials inside these phones.
Yeah. So interestingly enough, in the course of we've been working in the Gulistan underground market for about 4 or 5 years, and I didn't actually talk about some of a couple of the other things that are more about the repair workers are respiratory things, and eye strain and carpal tunnel syndrome, repetitive stress, and as you can imagine, given the nature of the work. The underground market has actually, during the course of our research, overhauled their ventilation system and has become a significant, and installed air conditioning in parts. It's become a considerably cooler and healthier place to live. But it's not clear what was driving that. In Bangladesh, there are no systematic public health kinds of statistics that support that. There are things that we can find elsewhere from toxicology studies around recycling and waste questions. But so far, this world has not been super well studied in that systematic way.
Thank you, everybody. If anyone wants to come up and speak with us now, we'd be happy to talk with you more. Thanks for your interest.